inside the gates of hell. The most dangerous day in ADX Florence and Alcatraz history. The day the rock shook. The morning of May 2nd, 1946, began like any other on Alcatraz Island. The cold wind off the San Francisco Bay, carrying with it the scent of salt, rust, and confinement. The clang of iron doors echoed through the concrete cell blocks as guards performed their daily routines. From the outside, the rock looked invincible, a fortress surrounded by icy waters and deadly currents, designed to crush the hopes of escape for even the most cunning criminal. But inside those walls, a storm was brewing, a storm that would explode into one of the deadliest prison uprisings in American history. At the center of it all was Bernard Paul Coy, a wiry, intelligent inmate with piercing eyes and a quiet resolve. Coy had been serving a 25-year sentence for bank robbery. Unlike many prisoners who resigned themselves to life on Alcatraz, Coy was patient and calculating. Over months, he studied the guards' routines, the layout of the cell blocks, and the weaknesses in the prison security. He was observant, a man who noticed everything, especially the moments when the guards seemed most vulnerable. Working as a cell house orderly gave Coy access few others had. He swept floors, delivered supplies, and watched the guards as they moved between posts. What he saw convinced him of one thing: even Alcatraz had cracks, and if those cracks could be exploited, freedom might just be possible. Coy knew it would take precision, courage, and men as desperate as he was. He found them in Joseph Kretzer and Marvin Hubbard, two hardened criminals who shared his hunger to escape. Their plan was simple in theory, but deadly in execution. Coy would overpower a guard during a routine work assignment, seize his keys, arm himself from the gun gallery, and release selected prisoners who would help him take control of the cell house. From there, they'd capture a few guards as hostages, use them as leverage to escape through the recreation yard, and hijack the prison launch to the mainland. Everything depended on timing and luck. At around 1:30 p.m., Coy made his move. During a quiet moment in Cell House D Block, he attacked guard William Miller, wrestling him to the ground and seizing his keys. In seconds, Coy had the guard restrained and locked in a cell. The adrenaline surged as he scaled the gallery bars, squeezing his thin body through the narrow openings to reach the gun gallery above, a feat no inmate had ever attempted before. There, he grabbed 2.45 caliber pistols, ammunition, and a gas mask. The rock was no longer under complete control. Coy quickly freed Kretzer and Hubbard. Together, they released other inmates they trusted, including Clarence Carnes, the youngest man ever imprisoned at Alcatraz, just 19 years old. With weapons in hand and several guards as hostages, the group seemed to have done the impossible. They had taken over the most secure prison in the United States. But fate turned against them in one cruel twist. Among the dozens of keys stolen from Miller was the one that opened the yard door, the final gateway to the dock and the water beyond. In his haste, Coy jammed it in the lock, twisting it until it broke. The door was now sealed, permanently. Without that key, they were trapped. Realizing the plan was collapsing, panic set in. Coy and Kretzer decided to fight their way out. For the next 48 hours, Alcatraz became a war zone. Inmates barricaded the cell house, firing through the bars and using the captured guards as human shields. The sound of gunfire and ricocheting bullets echoed through the prison's stone halls. Smoke filled the air. Prisoners screamed. Guards shouted commands over the roar of chaos. The Marines were called in after prison guards failed to regain control. Snipers took positions on rooftops. Grenades were lobbed through windows and holes drilled into the roof. The smell of gunpowder, oil, and burning metal filled the corridors. For those trapped inside, it was hell, raw, merciless, and deafening. By the morning of May 4th, it was over. Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard were dead, riddled with bullets. Two correctional officers, William Miller and Harold Stites, had been killed, and over a dozen others were injured. The floors of the cell house were slick with blood and broken glass. The uprising, later named the Battle of Alcatraz, left scars that never healed on the island, on the guards, and on the prisoners who survived. After the uprising, investigators found that Coy's plan had been meticulously crafted, but doomed by a single oversight: the jammed key. One wrong turn in the lock had sealed their fate. Alcatraz would never be the same again. Guards began wearing tear gas masks and carrying more weapons. The prison's already harsh rules became even more brutal, and in the minds of every inmate who walked those corridors afterward, the Rock was no longer just a prison. It was a living nightmare. For years, the sound of gunfire haunted those who lived through it. Survivors said the walls still seemed to echo with the screams of that day. It was the moment when Alcatraz's myth of absolute control was shattered. But history has a dark sense of repetition. Decades later, another fortress would rise from the sands of Colorado, one even more secure, more isolated, and more merciless than Alcatraz ever was. They called it ADX Florence, the supermax of all supermaxes. And one day within its concrete walls, America would once again witness the chaos of men trapped inside the gates of hell. Chaos in the supermax. When ADX Florence opened in 1994 in the dry, silent desert of Colorado, it was built as the answer to Alcatraz, the final word in prison security. Officially called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, this was not merely a prison. It was a machine designed to erase human defiance. No one called it by its full name. Guards and inmates alike simply called it the Supermax, or more chillingly, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Here, there were no open cell blocks or communal yards. Instead, there were 4-inch thick concrete walls, soundproof doors, and tiny windows angled so prisoners could see only the sky. Each man lived alone in a cell the size of a bathroom, 7 by 12 feet, for 23 hours a day. Meals were slid through a slot. Conversation was limited to muffled echoes through vents. The isolation was so intense that former Warden Robert Hood once said, "It's not designed for humanity." Among the inmates were men whose names had become infamous: the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, Ramzi Youssef of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker from 9/11. Each was confined in silence, buried alive within the concrete tombs of Florence. But even in a place engineered to eliminate rebellion, human nature still found a way to resist. The most dangerous day in ADX Florence's history began quietly, like all disasters do, with routine. On April 20th, 2005, correctional officers escorted inmates through the H Unit, the most restrictive area in the entire complex. Among them was Fahad Hashmi, an Islamist extremist, and Richard Lee McNair, a cunning escape artist who had already broken out of 2 federal prisons before being transferred to Florence. Tensions between radical inmates and guards had been growing for months, fed by constant isolation, sensory deprivation, and mental deterioration. That morning, as a guard opened a restraint slot to deliver food, an inmate used a sharpened metal piece hidden inside a legal folder to slash the officer's hand. In an instant, chaos erupted. 3 nearby prisoners began shouting and pounding on their doors, creating confusion, while others in adjoining cells hurled liquid, a mix of water, urine, and feces, through their food slots. Within minutes, more inmates joined, slamming steel against concrete, flooding their cells, and screaming profanities that echoed through the unit. The Special Operations Response Team, SORT, was deployed, a heavily armed group of officers, trained for high-risk confrontations. As they moved through the narrow corridors, inmates screamed threats, some smearing blood on their walls, others setting fires by igniting tissue paper with stolen electrical wires. The air filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning plastic. Then came the moment that turned a disturbance into a full-scale crisis. Inmate William "Billy" Blake, a convicted cop killer from New York State, serving a life sentence in solitary, managed to slip out of his restraints during a routine transfer. In a flash, he lunged at a guard, striking him repeatedly before being tackled by 3 others. His outburst inspired others in nearby cells to start smashing light fixtures and cameras. Within minutes, parts of H Unit went dark. The lockdown alarms blared through the entire facility. The warden ordered an immediate institution-wide lockdown, sealing every cell in Florence. Helicopters circled overhead, while local law enforcement surrounded the outer perimeter in case of a breakout. The chaos lasted nearly 9 hours. When the smoke cleared, 4 officers were injured, and 2 inmates had to be hospitalized after being subdued with pepper spray and concussion grenades. No one had escaped, but the psychological impact was immense. It was the closest ADX Florence had ever come to losing control, the day the unbreakable fortress trembled. An internal investigation later revealed that the riot was not spontaneous. It had been planned over months through a covert communication system, tapping on plumbing pipes, flashing mirrors, and sending coded messages through legal mail. The inmates had studied guard patterns, just as Bernard Coy had done on Alcatraz decades earlier. The similarities were haunting. Different eras, different prisons, but the same human hunger for freedom had ignited both infernos. In the aftermath, the Bureau of Prisons implemented sweeping reforms, thicker restraint slots, reinforced escort protocols, and increased psychological monitoring. But critics argued that the very conditions that provoked the riot, total isolation, sensory deprivation, and hopelessness, remained untouched. Former inmates later described ADX as a living coffin, a place that slowly disintegrated the mind. Forensic psychologists who studied survivors of long-term confinement there reported alarming rates of self-mutilation, hallucinations, and suicide attempts. If you put people in cages long enough, one psychiatrist said, eventually the cages fight back through them. Today, both Alcatraz and ADX Florence stand as twin monuments to the extremes of American incarceration, one rusting quietly in the San Francisco Bay, the other still operating in the Colorado desert. Separated by half a century, both prisons share a legacy of human defiance against impossible odds. The events at Alcatraz in 1946 and at Florence in 2005 proved that even the most controlled environments cannot suppress the will to resist. As one retired guard once said about that day inside the Supermax, "We built a place to hold the devil himself, but we forgot that men, even devils, still have hearts that beat." The walls of Florence are silent again now, just as the waters around Alcatraz are calm. But beneath that silence lies a truth carved into every brick and bar, that no prison, no matter how strong, can ever completely cage the human soul.